This podcast is on assumptions underlying social science research. As usual, I list the module learning outcomes. The first outcome is to identify the assumptions that social scientists make when conducting research. The second assumption is to explain, the second outcome is to explain how the assumptions social scientists make influence theoretical development and data analysis. And the third learning outcome is to identify different levels of analysis in social science research. These building blocks will help us better understand social science research and will get us in a better position to conduct that research ourselves. First of all, here's a pretty big question. In terms of social sciences versus natural sciences, it's often said that social science is somewhat soft in comparison to natural science, which is considered to be a hard science. In other words, social scientists really do not discover the same types of things with the same type of certainty that natural scientists do. Indeed, that is an assumption that is often made, and that assumption can be debatable. Prior to all of that, though, can social scientists discover the truth about the social world with as much certainty as scientists who study the natural world? That is an open question. And of course, it depends upon how you would define the word truth. In much social science research, especially the kind that we will be consuming a lot of this semester, quantitative social science research, we often express the truth as a probability, as in the likelihood of a behavior to take place given the presence of certain independent variables that explain that behavior. Here are other questions to consider as we go along. The first one has to do with one of the big words in our course, ontology. In other words, ontology refers to what the nature of the social world is. What is our environment like? And how can we explain it? Indeed, can we study the social world in an objective fashion or only subjectively? Objective here refers to taking opinions, feelings, emotions out of our judgment about the world, and subjectively refers to, well, keeping those things in our mind as we make judgments about the world. And here's an example to consider in thinking about the concept of ontology. For instance, we can say, thanks to Galileo, with certainty that gravity does exist. There is a force that keeps objects tethered to the Earth. But can we say with certainty that an important social science concept or political science concept, party identification, exists? Can we say with certainty that party identification exists? It is, in fact, what's called a social construct. It's not tangible. It exists in our minds. It may be very influential, but it's not something that just simply exists like a physical object exists. It's something that we have to conjure up or conceive of ourselves. We certainly know that party identification does have an impact on how people view themselves politically and how they vote. If you say you're a Republican, that probably gives you a certain perspective on issues in the United States and on candidates as well. Same if you identify yourself as a Democrat or as an independent. That's party identification. We know that that impact is real, but we also know that that impact is not as consistent as gravity impacts objects. Gravity always has an impact. Sometimes party identification is important, and sometimes it's not. So biases can affect our understanding of this social construct, this concept, party identification. Another big word in our course is epistemology. In other words, epistemology deals with what is knowable, what is our knowledge, what can we learn, and what can we not learn. Indeed, how can we know what we know? For instance, with party identification, how do we know that somebody identifies with a political party? Do we just simply ask them, as surveys do? Do we look at their voting behavior itself? and see how often they go to the ballot box and check off the Democratic candidate, the Republican candidate. How do we measure, in other words? How do we know what party identification is? And there's a side issue here that's also important. Some things are coincidental. You'll remember from the last podcast the issue of ice cream sales and drownings. That's a correlation. Those things happen, it seems like, at similar times, but they're not really causally related to one another. So there is an issue here also of correlation versus causation. Does party identification cause us to vote in a certain way? That's a pretty big statement to make, especially when there are a lot of factors that go into one's vote. Another word, methodology. That's inherent in our course on research methods. What methods should we use to obtain knowledge? And these methods differ, as we've looked at in previous podcasts, if we're doing qualitative research or non-numerical research versus quantitative research or numerical research. So I've got three approaches that your book also examines as well to applying the scientific method in social science research. Now, positivism and scientific realism tend to go together. In other words, their key assumption is that we can be objective in studying the social scientific world. We can simply measure a concept, hypothesize about how that concept affects another concept, test our hypothesis, and just simply look at the data and come to a conclusion. So that's taking a positivist perspective or a scientific realist perspective. Interpretivism, on the other hand, suggests that we cannot study the social world, the social scientific world, objectively. And we have to make judgments. And those judgments are not necessarily the same for one person as they are for another person. In other words, behavior is highly contextualized, having to do with us as individuals, what groups we are members of, where we live in the world, those kinds of things. We'll go a little more in depth. So positivism, again, assumes that social scientists can study the social world objectively. Thus, social scientists can use the scientific method as described in previous podcasts and in your textbook. Social scientists further can develop theories about the social world. Social scientists can also collect data and analyze data that have to do with those theories and the hypotheses that are created from those theories. But a positivist can only focus on what can be observed. So beyond that, social scientists have no real conclusions to add about the social scientific world. An important subfield within positivism is called behavioralism. And behavioralism became very popular after World War II when social science surveys became more plentiful and more doable thanks to computing technology. So the computers that were developed around World War II were used after the war, in essence, to further this type of understanding of social behavior. So behavioralism focuses on studying individual attitudes and behaviors and surveying people, or, in more recent times, performing experiments involving people. For instance, if we think about how social structure influences attitudes and choices, the family tends to have a major influence on party identification. So it's been found in surveys since roughly the early 1950s that party identification is what is called transmissible. It's transmitted through generations. Thus, if your parents are a Democrat, you're more likely to be Democrat. Notice more likely, probably more likely. If your parents are Republican, then you're more likely to be Republican. If you live in a split parental household, one Democrat, one Republican, then behavioralism really can't tell you which party you're going to belong to. Maybe you'll be an independent. But that's the type of question that behavioralists can address. Now, for a behavioralist, how do we know what we know? And what methods should we use? Well, I suggested that survey research is prolific, plentiful. We certainly have a lot of surveys that are available. Voting behavior is a topic that falls squarely within this notion of behavioralism. And so we focus on what are called large N statistical analyses. Thousands of cases, all amenable to statistical analysis. Another type of positivism, theoretically speaking, is called rational choice theory. Rational choice theory tends to develop, as the word suggests, a rationale for why people behave the way that they do. In order to develop this rationale, we need to know what individual preferences are. In other words, what would people rather do given a certain situation? Then a rational choice theorist tries to build a type of model to predict those actors' choices. And the assumption here, key assumption, is that actors make choices that allow them to obtain the best possible outcome for themselves. In other words, to obtain their preferences. There are some subfields of rational choice theory, or subfields, I suppose. Utility theory assumes actors only consider their own actions. And game theory assumes that when people are acting, they also consider other people's responses. So a quick example would be the famous experiments by Robert Axelrod, a political scientist, University of Michigan, trying to figure out what the default behavior is for people when they first interact with one another as strangers. Now, from a utility theory standpoint, you would think that individuals, when they meet strangers, would try to protect themselves as much as possible, and perhaps not be entirely friendly or cautious. Game theorists thus suggest that, well, certainly individuals might want to protect themselves and be cautious, but considering what other people are likely to do when they encounter a stranger, they're also likely to be relatively cautious too. So it might be more helpful to be friendly or mimic whatever the other person is doing. And in fact, Axelrod found that this tit-for-tat behavior is the way people generally behave when they first meet as strangers. If I shake your hand, you're likely to respond with a firm handshake. If I hit you, you're more likely to hit back. Tit for tat. So that is an outcome that can come from a type of rational choice theory. So other examples suggest that game theorists will think about, well, if an individual prefers to pass this type of legislation, Bill A to Bill B to Bill C, but Bill A cannot win and will not get enough support to pass. But Bill B can pass. The individual who prefers Bill B over Bill C at least might simply vote for Bill B as a type of compromise. So compromises can be modeled by this rational choice theory and this game theoretic perspective. There are also two approaches to using the scientific method that are really important: induction and deduction. Induction means data come first. Deduction means theory comes first. So let's explore a little bit more. When you're inductive, according to this schematic, you'll gather a lot of observations. Let's say a survey of individuals. You'll look for patterns in behavior. For instance, people who identify themselves as liberal vote for Democrats. Those who identify as conservatives vote for Republicans. Then you'll create a hypothesis. The hypothesis might be that an individual's ideological perspective helps to explain their party identification. And then build a theory behind that. And a theory suggests that ideology, left and right, can correspond roughly speaking, to, even though there's really large political parties, have the broad range of ideological positions in a political party. So someone on the political left is more likely to identify with the Democrats, who have at least some of their members on the left, if not all. And vice versa for the Republicans. Someone on the political right, ideologically speaking, can find people within the Republican Party who are also on the right. So the observations lead to theory building. Okay. Now, there's a deductive approach, and deductive approach runs in the opposite direction, where you build a theory, perhaps based upon your observation of human behavior, but not prior observation, directly speaking. Then you create hypotheses from that theory, you find your data set, and then you test your hypotheses to see if they're confirmed or not. So I'll go back very briefly. The deductive approach I suggested from the Axelrod example, the theory of people being cautious with each other suggests that they will mimic each other when they first meet as strangers. And we can collect observations, experiments to try to confirm this, and in fact, Axelrod was able to confirm this. So that's an example of a deductive approach. Scientific realism, which is a close relative of positivism, assumes that social scientists can study the social world objectively. They can also develop theories about the social world. What's different about scientific realism is that even though social scientists, as you do with positivism, can collect and analyze data, you can also focus on not just observed behaviors and have things to say about that, but also unobserved behaviors. What didn't happen, in other words. So a scientific realist differs in that the scientific realist can think about unobserved behavior and try to explain it as well. Unobserved causal mechanisms can be studied thus by studying their consequences. And a good example of this is that it's really hard to measure precisely just how influential specific leaders are. But we sure know that they're influential, and we know that people change behaviors if their leaders ask them to. So COVID-19 skeptics, for instance, had a great effect on people's behavior in regard to vaccinations. Those people who were skeptical about COVID-19 were far less likely to get vaccinated than those who were not. An interpretivist has a rather different perspective on the social world. The social world behaves differently from the natural world, and we cannot use the scientific method to analyze the social world. While we can observe a behavior, we can't assume that that behavior has the same meaning for everyone. And a simple example here is the myriad of reasons why people might choose to vote for a certain candidate. Sure, it could be party identification, it could be ideology, but it could also be, I don't particularly like this person, right? So affect might play a role. Or I don't like this particular person's behavior when I've observed them, either being interviewed or giving a speech or interacting with other people. So that's another factor. Voting for, may vote for the same candidate, but for slightly different reasons. Or not voting for the candidate, but for similar reasons. So an interpretivist can say, well, we can study people's behavior, but we cannot be quite as systematic about it as we would like to be. In other words, the uniqueness of people is what's critical here. Interpretivists assume we can understand human behavior, but we know that people are unique, so that their choices are influenced by a variety of factors. Here's a big slide, something you might want to screenshot. A takeaway message from this class. We're going to assume that social world that we examine can be studied like the natural world. We will indeed develop theories, hypotheses, discuss ways to conduct research design, discussing methods of data analysis, collecting information so that we can test hypotheses. But we will also be open to the idea that observed and unobserved causal mechanisms can be studied, that the positivist won't have a complete 100% claim on the truth. We also, from an interpretivist standpoint, will consider that people are indeed complex, and that some things are unmeasurable, that are interesting and important in trying to explain social scientific behavior. And a variety of factors can influence those choices that people make. Here are some other assumptions in social science research that are important. First of all, there are two levels of analysis that we can start with. One called the micro level, which is the individual. So understanding political behavior based on each individual person. And there's a way to study politics at the macro level too, where we study the behavior of a political party, reifying it, assuming that it is like a person or an organism of some sort. Political parties, legislatures, countries, governments, the globe itself, if we study international relations, that's all at what is called the macro level of analysis. We also have to consider, going back a slide or two, to think about preferences, right? We suggested that rational choice theorists will think of people as maximizing their preferences. Well, where do these preferences come from? Well, some of them come from biology. So, big five personality traits: extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, neuroticism. Those personality traits we display in certain ways. Some of us are more extroverted than others. Some of us are less agreeable to activities than others, or agreeable to new thoughts, and so forth. So biology can help us to shape our preferences. Social influences as well. I suggest that family was an important factor in the transmission of party identification across generations. Our friends, our teachers, if we're religious, our clergy, if we are, for into athletics, our coaches, authority figures, in other words, also are major social influences on our behavior. Social structures as well. If we think broadly about who has power in the United States, who has power around the globe, sociologists study this concept as well. In fact, C. Wright Mills, in The Power Elite, wrote a rather famous book on, well, who is it that actually has power? So that's an important topic to study in and of itself. But for us, at least for now, just consider that our actions are often constrained or restrained by just how much power we have in the world. A phrase that helps to summarize this is, the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. The strong do what they can to shape the world, and the weak do what they must to survive in the world. So other social structures of importance, institutions. Within the legislature, do legislators vote based on their own individual preferences on legislation? Or do legislators vote for bills that they think are popular with their constituents? Do legislators vote based on what their party leaders want them to do? Is it a kind of quid pro quo? If they continue to support legislation, will legislators put them on important committees and give them more power and influence in the legislature? Or is it just a norm or an expectation of behavior that party leaders will help to direct individual legislators on legislation? So social structures can help us to understand the notion of preferences.